Helman paused briefly halfway down the hill upon which Castle Tempelhof rested. There was a small outcrop of rocks that would provide him with a decent vantage point from which to view his enemy. Once he had dismounted his cart, it took him no time at all to clamber up the rock face and look down into the valley below. Helman soon spotted the impending force. They would likely reach the village tomorrow evening. It appeared that they had been slowed down by the unpredictable movement of a steam tank. Whilst that will have provided Helman with some advantage in time for gathering his troops, it would certainly be an unwelcome addition to von Korden's raiding party. Helman leapt down from his lofty viewpoint and regained his place atop the corpse cart. Picking up his trusty whip, he lashed his brothers into the shambling walk back towards Tempelhof. After a long journey back from the nearby castle, Helman eventually reached Tempelhof and his gathered troops at around noon the following day. He estimated that he had about 8 hours to make his final preparations ahead of the coming battle. Helman picked the best vantage point and arranged his troops accordingly. He would force von Korden's forces through the narrow pass north of Tempelhof and face them on the northern road just beyond the border of the village. That way, Helman would be afforded the element of surprise and could deal with the Empire's troops in a piecemeal manner. The battle plan decided, Helman sat and summoned the winds of magic to him. He opened his mind to all of the forces under his command and instilled them with his will, malice, and most of all, hate of the accursed von Korden and his troops. He visualized the coming battle and embedded his strategy and commands into each of the undead warriors. This way, once the battle started, he could focus on dealing with any unforeseen developments rather than maintaining a constant focus on each of his units. That done, Helman returned to his cart and retrieved his weapons and armour. Once donned, he mounted his cart and awaited the coming battle. It had been many years since Alberich von Korden had been to the unholy village of Tempelhof. The last time he visited the accursed village had proved a particularly fateful one for him. A young villager by the name of Helman Ghorst had lost all of his family members to the blue plague that had spread across Sylvania. Unfortunately, the deranged youngster had turned to necromancy to try and bring his family back to life. That sort of vile witchcraft could not be allowed to stand, however tragic the impulse to use it. As such, Alberich sought to thwart the young Helman before he could do any real damage. Despite his best efforts, Helman had managed to escape Alberich's clutches. He had been chasing the damned necromancer across Sylvania for years since that fateful day. One of Alberich's informants had told him that Helman and his death cart had been spotted several times in recent months, having taken up residence in and around Tempelhof once more. Hoping that he could deal with his Ghorst problem once and for all, Alberich had summoned a small raiding force to enter Tempelhof, surround Helman, and finally put an end to his foul existence. Von Korden and Helman had faced each other many times before. The Necro was adept at raising zombies, but always lacked the numbers to overcome Alberich. Now that he had his own force, the witch hunter was confident that he could deal with Helman's small retinue of zombies and finally end the cat-and-mouse game that had raged for so many years. Alberich and his knights passed through the narrow pass north of Tempelhof. As he emerged from the bottleneck valley, a smile crept across his face. There was Helman, sat on his cart, with around 20 zombies surrounding him. This would be even easier than he thought. Helman watched as the witch hunter emerged from the valley to the north. Even from this distance he could see the arrogant smile on Alberich's smug face. He thinks he's won, thought Helman. We'll see who's smiling in the end. Von Korden's confidence saw him charge his knights at Helman before the majority of his forces had even entered the other end of the narrow valley. This was perfect. Eric White had not been a Reiksguard knight for very long. As he and his brothers-in-arms galloped towards the waiting necromancer, he was proud that his first campaign into Sylvania would bring success so early on. Eric noticed a sudden movement to his right. He looked over at the rider to his right to find that he was now galloping alongside a riderless horse. He looked behind him to see if he had been knocked off his steed, but his fellow knight was nowhere to be seen. That was, until he looked up. A giant fellbat had the knight in its talons and was raising the man high into the air. With horror, Eric watched as the beast released its grip on the body, which then plummeted to a gory death on the rocks below. As the swarms of fellbats continued to pick off riders one at a time, the knights looked to the sky and tried to impale the beast on their swords. Had they not been so preoccupied with the death from above, they might have seen the packs of direwolves emerging from the nearby tree line and charging towards their trusty steeds. One by one, the wolves leapt at the throats of the horses and brought them down. Those knights who had not been lifted into the air were soon flung from their saddle as the horses were brought down by the lupine creatures of the forest. Alberich watched in horror as his elite knights were so easily dispatched by Helman's troops. The necromancer had obviously seen them coming. Alberich halted the advance of his remaining force. He had acted hastily in sending in the cavalry. He would now gather his forces on the southern side of the narrow pass and send in a unified force to dispatch the necromancer and his damned creatures of the forest. Von Korden awaited the arrival of his infantry and steam tank before beginning the advance. Helman watched as the Empire's force began to move towards him. The knights that had survived the initial surprise attack and had been flung from their saddle had put up a good fight. They managed to dispatch around half of his wolves and bats before finally being put to rest. Once the Empire force was halfway down the road towards him, Helman drew the winds of magic to him once more. Rise, my pretties, rise. A feeling of dread filled the heart of Alberich as he watched the bodies of his recently fallen comrades begin to twitch. They slowly and mindlessly rose to their feet and began a dreadful shamble towards their living kin. The horror of watching your brothers in arms being used as puppets to fight against you was something that no man ought to witness. The feeling of dread in Alberich's heart soon increased as he realized that it was not only the cadavers of his fallen brothers that had swelled the necromancer's ranks, but also countless other bodies. Zombies and skeletons alike were slowly but surely emerging from the plague pits that lined the road, and they were now bearing down on his forces from all sides. Alberich ordered the infantry to reform and deal with the flank attack from the zombies. Alberich would take the steam tank and a smaller group of warriors south to deal with Helman. Whilst an individual zombie would be no match for a member of the Empire infantry, the sheer numbers and relentlessness of the undead horde favoured Helman's troops. Alberich knew that whilst he had superior fighting forces, his men would eventually get tired, and, when that happened, the undead horde would easily dispatch his troops. If he could deal with Helman before his men lost energy, there could still be a chance. Von Korden's retinue soon dispatched the remaining wolves and small number of zombies on the road between the Empire and Helman. The road was now clear for Alberich and the steam tank to advance. The crewman of the steam tank made the final preparations to unleash the full power of his weapon. He looked out from the top of the tank. There was the necromancer in his infernal cart, just up by the border of the village. He would soon be upon the fiend and in a position to send him to his doom. The thought that he could be the one to end the existence of the foul creature brought a smile across the crewman's face. The smile did not last long. "What fresh hell is this?" cried Alberich as the temperature around him began to drop. From behind one of the houses at the end of the village, a giant creature of rotten flesh and bone emerged. The Terrorgeist flew the short distance and landed directly ahead of the steam tank. As it landed, a host of ghostly figures appeared around Alberich and his remaining infantry guard. The guardsmen swung their swords at the ghostly figures to no effect. Their weapons passed through the ghost like a knife through steam. There was nothing they could do but watch in terror as the ghostly fiends reached out and gripped the living men's hearts before freezing them and stopping them forever. Alberich watched as the Terrorgeist filled its rotten lungs with air and let out a terrible scream directed at the steam tank. Despite not being the focus of the scream, Alberich realized that he had still felt its effect. His nose and ears poured with blood. Alberich could but imagine what fate had befallen the poor crew of the steam tank. With nobody left to direct or defend it, the tank soon shuddered and stopped before being set upon by 3 hulking Vargeists that swooped down from above. The pressure on one of the rear pipes caused it to buckle and fracture. A blast of hot air escaped and narrowly missed Alberich's face. Von Korden looked across at his long-standing enemy. As he contemplated charging at Helman and trying to dispatch him himself, 3 banshees rose from the ground ahead of the grinning necromancer. A heroic charge to deal with his nemesis could only serve to ensure that Alberich was destroyed. Instead, he decided to flee and live to fight another day. North across the battlefield, Alberich looked on in dismay to see that his men had all but been destroyed. Those few survivors would soon fall, and now only served to keep the zombies at bay until Alberich made it back to the entrance of the valley and could escape the village of Tempelhof. He watched in disgust as Helman's ghouls began tearing at the flesh of Alberich's fallen troops. The proud army that he had led south would now only serve to swell both the bellies of the ghouls and the ranks of Helman's army. That was a fate that would not befall Alberich von Korden, but, for the time being, he was defeated. Helman cried out in joy as he watched the last man of Alberich's army fall to the ground, his throat in the hands of one of Helman's zombies. Whilst disappointed that Alberich had escaped, he savoured the feeling of his success and the defeat of the raiding party. He knew that with the witch hunters remaining at large, there would be further challenges to face in the future. He was, however, proud of his success over the last month. He reminisced about the friends he had made and the fantastic work he had seen done. May had seen Helman's first challenge successfully completed, and his first large-scale battle won. There would be more challenges in the future, but, given how much he had enjoyed the current challenge, he knew he would relish the thought of doing it again next year. For now, he could return to normal life. As he contemplated what this meant, he smiled and uttered the heartfelt, if out-of-context phrase, "Thanks, Warbosstae." The end.